Beth stepped out of the building, gasping for air after leaving the courtroom. It took her nearly a minute to catch her breath, and when she did, she had to sit down. That hearing marked the end of a series of events that began almost a year prior. Once she regained her composure, Beth's mind wandered back to the days following her encounter with Hal nearly a decade ago. At 22, fresh from Air Force basic training, Beth had just arrived at her Missouri duty station. Raised with weekly church worship, her life took a turn as she found herself drinking heavily and engaging in casual encounters in the barracks. Following her second hospital visit for an antibiotic shot, Beth decided to make a change. She gave up alcohol and the casual flings. It was then that Hal entered her life. She and Hal stayed together, and finally, both were stationed at Langley Air Force Base in Virginia. After catching her breath, she started walking toward her car. She noticed a small cafe and decided to grab some coffee before she started her long drive back to her Georgia hometown. While sitting at the counter, Beth's mind started to go back to the day she met Hank and her life imploded. She had met Hank and was instantly drawn to him. By this time, Hal and Beth were the parents of 2 small children. Beth did not notice the small changes, but Hal did. One night after they put the kids to bed, Hal made a pot of coffee and told Beth they needed to talk. Beth remembered getting defensive and knowing full well Hal would kick her out if he even came close to knowing anything about Hank. Thus, the dangerous cat-and-mouse game started. Beth, after going off duty that morning, was driving across the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel on her way from Hampton to Virginia Beach to see Hank, and did not notice the Toyota Tundra pickup following her. The man driving that pickup was a close friend of Hal's who was off that morning, and Hal had asked him to follow her. He followed her to the exit off I-264 and past Mount Trashmore Park. After about 5 minutes, Beth drove up into Hank's driveway, and he came out and hugged her, and they went inside. The friend took note of the address, took some photos, and drove back to Hampton, entered Langley Air Force Base, and drove into the parking lot outside of Hal's unit. When the friend told Hal about what he witnessed, Hal broke down. Even as he did, his first words were about his kids. The friend later told Hal to have peace of mind to get both kids' DNA tested before he made any decisions about his marriage. This friend also gave Hal the business card of a family law attorney. Hal made an appointment to see Amanda, the attorney, the next day. They talked, and Hal showed her the photos and asked about the kids. Amanda told Hal where to go, and he took both kids, and all 3 had their mouths swabbed for DNA. Then Hal went to the Langley Credit Union, opened a new account, went back to the base, and had his pay changed to go to that new account. Following step by step the directions his attorney carefully outlined with him. Hal was heartbroken as he looked at the children, knowing they would grow up in a broken home, and it gutted him. Beth was a security police officer, and currently, she was working overnight shifts. Hal was assigned to the Joint Base Langley Eustis and almost always worked days. That night he drove to the parking area where Beth parked her car, and using his key entered it, and took note of the odometer reading. Then he returned home. Hal did this for almost 2 full weeks, writing down the miles Beth was putting on the car. Finally, Hal had enough, and he took some time off and met with his attorney. He started the divorce paperwork, and because they lived off base, it was determined the best way to serve her was at home. The day before Beth was due to be served, Hal took his kids and stayed at a local hotel after she left for her duty that night. Hal knew all-out war was going to start that next day, and he wanted his kids out of the line of fire. Hal had left a note for Beth that the kids were safe and left. Then that night he went to bed. Beth drove to her home in Poquoson and noted a deputy sheriff parked in front of her home. Still in uniform, she watched the deputy as he walked toward her car. The deputy said, "Are you Elizabeth and Frank's?" "Yes, I am," said Beth. "I have some paperwork I need to give you, ma'am," said the deputy. After handing the paperwork to Beth, the deputy started walking away. When Beth opened the envelope, she saw it was divorce paperwork citing adultery as the grounds. Beth grabbed her phone and called Hank. Hank answered, and Beth cried out, "Hank, Hal knows about us. I don't know how he found out, but he knows." Hank just ended the call, and in doing so startled Beth. All plans Beth had to drive to Virginia Beach were abandoned. Beth started walking to the house, and as she opened the screen door, saw a letter taped on the door. In Hal's handwriting, it directed Beth to go stay with Hank. Her keys no longer worked. The kids were safe for now. Beth felt her stomach move and she knew she needed to eat, but after a short drive only had coffee. She needed internet access so she could use her laptop to check to see what Hal had done with their joint bank account both had their pay directly deposited into. Sitting there, Beth used her cell phone's hotspot and opened the credit union's web access. After several moments she saw where Hal had withdrawn several $1,000s but left a good portion. Beth sighed as she drove back to the base, spoke to her first sergeant about the problem, and asked about a day or two off. The man just stared at Beth. "You did what?" the man asked. By this time Beth was crying. Then he addressed her as Technical Sergeant Franks. "I don't have a lot of time for you this morning. You need to speak to either your supervisor or Lieutenant Shackelford about time off. Now get out of my office." As she turned to leave, her shoulders slumped. Then the man added, "And close the damn door behind you." Beth did as instructed, and although she was crying, made the journey into the security office and spoke to the captain. Captain Jennings was a female security officer about 30 years old, herself recently divorced. Beth just collapsed as she became inconsolable. The officer, understanding her emotional situation, closed her office door and sat beside Beth. "Am I in trouble?" Beth asked. The officer paused and then told Beth, "No trouble with the Air Force, but you most likely are headed for a divorce." "Sergeant, I do have to give you an official order though." The officer left the office and returned about 5 minutes later. "Sergeant, I am having a letter typed up for you to sign, and I will also sign. I will have the letter copied and give you a copy. I will then place my copy as a memo of record into one of my files. I will also have another person to witness what is happening. Sergeant Franks, I am giving you an official written order to have no intimate contact with any man other than your husband. Do you understand this order? Not following this order can result in you being charged under Articles 90 and 92 of the UCMJ." Beth was almost dizzy as she signed the paper in front of her, and as she was about to walk out of the office stopped when the officer said, "Sergeant, one last thing. Have you been tested for STDs?" Beth thought about that question as she said, "No, ma'am, I have not been tested." "Then I suggest you get over to the hospital and get tested. Oh, and by the way, I am taking you off the schedule for the rest of the week." "Sergeant, do you have any leave time left?" said the officer. Beth replied, "Ma'am, I have about 35 days. The officer said, "Come back to see me on Friday." "Yes, ma'am," said Beth as she walked out of the office. As Beth walked out of the building, her phone buzzed after receiving a text message. She pulled the phone out of her pocket and saw Hal's face on the screen. Beth opened the messaging app and started to read the text. "Beth, I took the day off and I am sitting at the IHOP on Mercury with the kids. They miss their mother, and you need to get your butt over here now." Beth decided to see her kids. Beth cried all the way to the restaurant and was at a loss for what to say to Hal when she got there. When she got there, she got out of her car and entered the restaurant. When she did, she could hear her daughter say, "Mommy, we are here." Beth smiled and sat across from Hal and next to her son sitting in a high chair. Hal smiled and asked Beth if she had eaten that morning. Beth replied, "No, Hal, but I did have some coffee earlier." At about that time, a waitress approached the table and asked Beth if she was going to order food. "No, I am okay, thank you," said Beth. As she said that, Hal's eyes narrowed, and his face took on a somber mood. "Beth, regardless of the condition of our marriage, you have 2 children that need their mother. I can see you have been crying, but you must take care of yourself. If for nothing, do it for these babies. Beth, this is my final warning. Get some help." Beth at first wanted to get angry at Hal's attitude in front of the kids, but then realized he was not being mean, just tired and trying to do what was best for their children. Beth got up and kissed both of her kids, looked at Hal and said, "Hal, I need to get in the house to get some things. I am going to ask Ginger if she will let me crash at her place." Hal looked at Beth and said, "Beth, I have already packed your things. They are in boxes in the guest bedroom. Get some of your friends and come over to get them. Just let me know when you are coming so I can arrange to have a deputy there as a witness." Beth just glared at Hal. So, this is what we have been reduced to now, Hal? Beth said in reply. Hal just sighed and went back to eating. Beth walked to her car and started crying. As she got back onto Mercury, her mind went back to the fact that her enlistment was up in about 90 days. She started to think about Athens, Georgia, and how long it had been since she had seen her family. With her security police experience, she knew getting Georgia Post certified would be easy, and she could easily get a job as a cop in the Athens-Clarke County area. Beth sighed as she thought about walking away from the Air Force, but knew she was most likely headed back to Europe if she re-enlisted based on a conversation she had with her unit's career NCO. As Beth drove under the I-64 bridge, she decided to go on and head across the James River Bridge and go on to Smithfield and see Ginger. She had no clothes but was not in the mood to return to what was once her home to get some. Beth was also mad at Hank. How dare he hang up on me? Beth screamed out loud. By the time Beth got to Ginger's, she found Ginger at home, and as she pulled into her driveway, Ginger walked out onto her front landing and smiled at Beth. Then Ginger saw the look on Beth's face and asked, Beth, are you okay, honey? Beth just looked at Ginger and said, Gin, Hal found out about Hank. All the color left Ginger's face and she told Beth, Get in here, and turned around and walked inside with Beth following her. As this was happening, Hal had finished eating and was on his way with the kids to see if a teenager he knew would watch the kids so he could get over to see his attorney Amanda. At the attorney's office, Hal broke down again. Amanda stopped the meeting and let Hal get the venom out of his system. Later, Hal explained that his parents warned him about Beth. Hal knew she was a barracks bunny but was willing to overlook these things. Hal shook his head in a brief period of reflection. Why was I so stupid? Amanda asked Hal. Hal, are you sure you want to continue the divorce using these grounds? Hal replied, Yes, in 20 or so years I want my kids to understand why they grew up in a broken home. The attorney told Hal the DNA results should be back in about 3 or 4 days. Keep a lookout for either a text message or an email from Quest Diagnostics. Then she stood up and said, I have another appointment in about 10 minutes and a Zoom hearing after that. Amanda had already given Hal her card, so she shook Hal's hand as he left the office. At about this same time, Mary was sitting in her office in Virginia Beach going over some spreadsheets when her boyfriend Hank called her. Hank told her he wanted to see her as soon as they could get together. Mary then said, Okay, come over and we can talk in my office. Hank said, Okay, Mary, I will be there in about 20 minutes. When Hank arrived, he walked into the office and sat down. Then he sighed and said, Mary, I have made a serious error in judgment. I have been sleeping with another woman. I understand if you want nothing to do with me. Mary just glared at Hank and said, Hank, what the hell? Why are you dumping this on me now? Then she started to cry. Hank just looked down and said, Mary, her husband found out, and it was just a matter of time before you found out. I wanted to be the one to tell you. I have already packed up and ready to leave. Mary stood up and using a string of profanities said, Who is she? Hank looked at Mary and said, Her name is Beth Franks, and she is in the Air Force stationed over at Langley. I am sorry, Mary. Get out of my office and my life, you sorry piece of crap. Mary screamed. Slowly Hank left the office, walked out to his already packed vehicle, and started to head out back to his home in Roanoke, Virginia. By this time Mary was livid. She was determined to find this tramp and make her pay. Picking up her phone, she called a friend who worked at Langley and asked them to find out what they could do about this Beth Franks person. Back in Smithfield, Beth and Ginger were finishing some soup, and Ginger asked her about the kids. Beth said, Right now I have to find an attorney. Ginger said, Wait a minute, I have a card of an attorney who works out of Newport News. Ginger got up and came back several minutes later with the card. Handing it to Beth, she looked at it, entered the number into her phone, and handed the card back to Ginger. Then Ginger got a serious look on her face and asked Beth, Beth, what are your intentions when it comes to those kids? Beth looked down at the floor and said, Gin, right now they are safe, but at some point, Hal and I will have to come to some form of an agreement. I have decided to get out in 90 days and move back home to Athens. My kids are going with me. Back in Virginia Beach, Hank was on his way back to Roanoke when he decided to call Beth one last time. Beth did not answer, so he left a brief message. Beth, I am sorry our affair blew up the way it did. I am leaving the area and Mary knows about us. Have a wonderful life, Beth, but please don't ever attempt to contact me again. Beth read the message and started to cry all over again. Then she started to think about Mary knowing. Then she remembered she needed to get some things from Kroger and drove over there. After checking out, she drove back to Ginger's home and unloaded the groceries. That evening, Hal was sitting in his dining room watching his kids eat their dinner. Both were already asking about their mother. Hal said, Mommy is staying with Aunt Ginger right now. Okay, Daddy, both said, and they went back to playing with their tablets. Hal sat for a few minutes, and he was getting so angry at Beth that he could feel the bile rising in his throat. He got up and made some coffee, then stepped out onto the patio and stood. Hal lost his ability to not cry, then started to cry so bad his stomach was heaving. The sobs were racking his body. Hal had loved Beth from the day he first saw her that day years ago at Whiteman Air Force Base. Then just an airman, but there was something about her eyes that made his heart tingle. Over time he started to get to know her better. Then he started to hear the rumors she had become a barracks bunny and was being tossed around like a toy. At first, Hal refused to believe any of them. Then one day he saw her walking out of the quarters of a male, and his heart dropped. Hal then decided to start building his career and left Beth alone. That is until Beth knocked on his door almost a full year later, and her eyes were red from crying. She had that day been to the base hospital after getting an antibiotic shot and getting her butt chewed out by her commanding officer. Over time, Hal began to fall for Beth all over again. Beth swore off alcohol and promised to stop the random hookups. Then one day he and Beth were married. After they were married, Hal received orders for Germany and left Beth at Whiteman with their then 6-month-old child. Over the next few years, their marriage was mostly long distance until finally both were stationed at Langley. Hal's family never liked Beth, but they put up with it for Hal and their grandkids' sake. Then Hal learned Beth was cheating. Hal slept fitfully that night. Then that next morning he received a phone call from Quest Diagnostics that the DNA results were back, and he needed to come by. When Hal arrived, he was met by a female, and after he was offered some coffee sat down. The news was not good. Both kids were not his and the test was done 2 times. Hal got the reports and called his attorney, then went by her office and gave the paperwork to a paralegal in the office. Then Hal returned home. Beth woke up that same morning with a bad feeling about everything. She did not know who the real father of her kids was, but she hoped it was Hal. She went ahead and made an appointment with the attorney Ginger had recommended. As Beth was leaving the attorney's office, just as she was about to unlock her car, she felt her hair pulled back violently. Then she felt the blows hitting her, and it took several moments to come to her senses. She had no idea who was attacking her but tried to pull away. Mary was holding her hair with one hand and hitting her with the other fist. A Newport News police officer was close by and was able to separate the women. Beth by then was bleeding from her eyes, nose, and mouth. Mary also had some of her hair still in her hand. After a few minutes, Beth discovered her attacker was Mary. The cop asked Beth if she wanted to press charges and added he was also going to charge Mary with disturbing the peace. Mary just looked at Beth and spat at her. The cop did not arrest Mary, but he did give her a summons to appear. Beth cleaned herself up as best as she could, drove back to Smithfield, and got into the shower. When Ginger got home from work, she saw the marks on Beth's face. "What in the hell happened to you, Beth?" Beth just looked at the ground and said, "Hank's girlfriend attacked me today." Ginger stood stunned as she digested Beth's words. Then Beth started to cry. Ginger gave Beth some pills to help her sleep and for pain. Then after her bath fed Beth and put her to bed. Hal was in his attorney's office early that next morning as they discussed the DNA results. Amanda asked Hal what his plans was. Hal just sat still, stunned at how things had fallen apart. "Fight for my kids. I see no reason to use these results, Amanda, because I have developed a relationship with both of them, and I'd be damned if I will let Beth have them too corrupt." Amanda took the time to go over Virginia law as it dealt with getting a mother to be considered unfit. Amanda had experience doing it, but she also knew most times these rulings got reversed over time. She did not want Hal to get his hopes up, so she just told Hal, "Hal, I will do what I can, that is all I can promise." Then they discussed the settlement and possible child support, and after about 20 minutes they ended the meeting and Hal returned to the base and resumed his work. Beth awoke that next morning to the smell of coffee and bacon. She quickly got up, took a shower, put on some jeans, and walked into the kitchen to find Ginger had left a note that she had to go to work early but would be back home early in the afternoon. Beth had a cup of coffee while she heated the breakfast Ginger made in the microwave, poured some orange juice, and ate. Afterward, Beth drove to the base to let the proper people know of her decision not to re-enlist. She then drove to her unit and was met at the door by her supervisor, Master Sergeant Morris. "In my office now, Franks," he said. "Yes, sir," Beth replied. Beth followed her supervisor to the office and was about to sit when the man still standing looked at her and said, "Franks, do not sit down, stand in front of me because I have some instructions for you, understand?" Beth stood up and faced her supervisor and said, "Yes, sir." "Franks, I am disappointed to learn you have blown up your marriage. I spoke to Captain Jennings yesterday, and I also have a copy of those written orders she issued to you. Beginning tomorrow you are on days." Beth started to say something when the man shouted, "Shut up, Franks, I am not finished. These past 3 days are coming off your leave balance, Franks. You are not well liked in this unit now. You have let me down as well as the airmen you used to supervise. I am not sure what the colonel wants you to do, but you are office bound for the time being. Now get out of this office." Beth replied, "Yes, sir," and turned around and left the office. What Beth did not know was Captain Jennings was stationed at Edwards Air Force Base when her then-husband started an affair with an officer who worked with one of the defense contractors and did not take it well. That ex-husband had his career ruined and she asked for and was granted a PCS from Edwards. As Beth was walking to her car, her phone buzzed, and she saw it was a call from Hal. "Beth, the kids want to see their mother. I suggest you get over to the sitter sometime this morning and see those kids." Beth said, "Okay, Hal, I am on my way." "Hal, is there a chance the two of us can talk sometime soon?" There was a brief silence on the line and finally, Hal said, "Beth, from now on I think it's best if we speak through our lawyers. We are looking at the end of our marriage right now." Beth said, "Okay, Hal, I understand. Do you want my lawyer's information?" Hal replied, "Beth, call my attorney Amanda Walters. I will text you the number." Then Hal ended the call and texted that phone number to Beth. Then he went back to work. Beth got in her car and drove up to Yorktown and visited with her kids. While there, Beth excused herself and called Ginger. When Ginger answered, Beth asked her if she would be okay with me bringing the kids to your house. Ginger replied, "Beth, you are playing with fire. I think you need to leave those kids with Hal for the time being." Beth said, "Okay, Ginger, I am on days starting tomorrow. We can talk more later." Beth ended the call and returned to the house and said bye to her kids. Almost 6 months later, Hal and Beth were in court going over all the events of the previous 6 months. The judge was brutal in his rulings. Hal got full custody of the kids and child support from Beth. By this time, Beth had got out of the Air Force and was a Georgia deputy sheriff. Beth was not able to take a breath until she got out of the courthouse. After finishing her coffee at the diner, she headed back to Athens, Georgia. Almost a full 10 years later, Beth, now in her late 30s, was still living and working in Athens. Many years prior, she was allowed to start to visit with her kids, now in their teens, unsupervised. After Hal retired, he moved to Florida. Almost 4 years after his divorce was final, he remarried. The last time he saw Beth, he knew the years had not been kind to her. She could not be more than 100 pounds now. Hal never said anything bad about Beth in front of those kids. He also dreaded the day when they would be ready to hear the truth about him not being their biological father. The kids were thriving with their father, though. Hal also had heard that Beth had several miscarriages and could not help but shake his head. Beth is playing around with her health as well as her physical well-being if she doesn't stop messing around with married men. Anyway, Hal finished his coffee and walked back inside the house to see what his wife wanted. Back in Georgia, Beth was sitting in the waiting room of the Emory Medical Clinic waiting to see her doctor. She had not felt good and went to see her primary care doctor in Athens, who put in a consultation for her to see this specialist at Emory. Beth had an MRI done earlier that week and now was waiting for the results. By this time, Beth was now using her maiden name of Woods. "Beth Woods," the nurse said aloud, and Beth answered, "That's me." She got up and followed the nurse into the exam room. Was told the doctor would be in shortly. About 10 minutes later, the doctor entered and sat down. The doctor said, "Miss Woods, I have examined all the images as well as the lab work ordered. Miss Woods, one of the lab tests was a natriuretic peptides test. Normal results for this test should be under 100 picograms per milliliter. Miss Woods, yours was almost 600. The doctor wrote Beth some prescriptions and said, "I want to see you in about 2 weeks. The doctor said, "Those results were indicative of heart failure, but I want to schedule you for a stress test. This test can be done at the hospital in Athens." Beth left the clinic in a daze. Years ago, Hal had warned me if I kept up this lifestyle I was playing with fire. As she exited the highway to I-85 northbound, she sighed and thought about the future. After Beth passed under the I-285 bridge, she called Hal. She told Hal what had happened and noticed the silence on the other end. Hal finally said, "Beth, you have 2 kids that need their mother. Remember this." Beth ended the call and drove back to Athens. When she got home, Beth stripped and sat in her bathtub. Over the next hour, drank almost a quarter of a bottle of whiskey. Then, taking a box cutter, cut both of her wrists. It was almost 24 hours later when Beth's sister Janice told Hal that he needed to bring the kids to Athens if they wanted to say bye to their mother. Hal just dropped the phone and started to sob all over again. Beth's funeral was very sad. Both of her kids just stood under the tent at the cemetery, and while both were not crying, they were sad. Hal and his wife both sighed as they told the kids to get in the car. On the long drive back to Florida, both of Beth's kids knew they had loving parents and would be okay. Both were angry, though, that their mother did that selfish thing. Both resolved to never enter that cemetery again.